The sand of the arena absorbs the blood, but it does not erase the memory of those who fall. The relentless sun casts its flames upon the merciless earth, reflecting the shine of swords clashing with fate. The roar of the crowd echoes like thunder within the stone walls, eager for violence, thirsty for spectacle. Amidst this whirlwind of brutality and fleeting glory, a man rises, not just to fight, but to challenge an empire. His name has crossed centuries, etched in history as a cry for freedom suffocated by tyranny. Spartacus. He was not the first to fight for freedom, nor would he be the last, but he was the one whose story transcended the walls of immortal Rome, defying its greatness, scratching its supremacy, forging a myth where once there was only a slave. But who was Spartacus before he became legend? A warrior from Thrace, dragged into slavery by the very Romans who feared his fury. A man trained for spectacle, shaped by pain, programmed to kill and entertain. But within his chest burned something the Romans could not break, the spark of insubordination. The incandescent desire not to be a disposable piece in the game of an empire that bathed in blood to feed its grandeur. In the ludus of Capua, the school of gladiators where Spartacus's fate seemed sealed, men learned that pain was a merciless master and death, an inevitable lover. They were trained to face agony, to rise after each blow, to become caged beasts. But Spartacus did not accept the chains, nor the fate imposed upon him. He did not see the arena as a spectacle, but as a prison. And like every incarcerated man, he dreamed of escape. And then, like thunder in the oppressive silence, the uprising began. With improvised knives and the courage of those who have nothing to lose, he and his companions rose against their tormentors. 70 men faced the impossible. They defeated trained guards, seized their weapons, and escaped to the hills. But what began as a simple escape soon became a revolution. Slaves from across the peninsula heard the rumors. A gladiator had freed himself. And not only that, he was gathering an army. What happened next was an unprecedented event. Men and women, humiliated and punished throughout their lives, saw in the figure of Spartacus the opportunity to strike back. Oppressed, landless peasants, defeated soldiers who had been reduced to nothing, all joined the uprising. The small group of fugitives grew. First hundreds, then thousands. Until it was no longer just a slave rebellion. It was a war against Rome. The Senate initially ignored the threat. After all, how could a band of slaves challenge the greatest empire in the world? But soon they realized that Spartacus was not just a gladiator who knew how to wield a sword. He was a strategist, a born leader, a commander capable of defeating Roman generals with improvised tactics and sharp intelligence. The civilized world watched in astonishment as entire legions fell before an army of former slaves. But there was a problem. Spartacus did not want to just fight, he wanted freedom. He dreamed of taking his people far away, crossing the Alps, and disappearing forever, far from Roman chains. But not everyone shared his dream. Many wanted revenge. They wanted to see Rome burn. They wanted the slave masters to experience the same despair they had felt throughout their lives. And this internal conflict was the harbinger of the tragedy to come. Rome finally sent its champion, Marcus Licinius Crassus. A cold, calculating general, merciless. He knew that Spartacus could not be defeated by brute force alone. He would use strategy, hunger, time. Slowly, he surrounded the rebel army, cut off their supply routes, and pushed the survivors to a final battlefield. The end was inevitable. Spartacus, knowing that defeat was certain, refused to flee. If he was to die, let it be fighting. Let his name not be forgotten. Let Rome know that, for a brief moment, a slave made it tremble. His body was never found. But his actions echoed forever. The Romans crucified thousands of his followers along the Appian Way, turning the road into a corridor of death, a cruel reminder of the price of rebellion. But even with this display of absolute power, they never managed to erase the myth of Spartacus. Because Spartacus was not just a man. He was the embodiment of something that Rome could never completely destroy, the desire for freedom. Centuries passed. Rome fell. But the name of Spartacus survived. Not as that of a mere gladiator, but as an immortal symbol of resistance. And now, after so much time, I ask, if you were in his place, what would you do? Would you accept the imposed fate or rise against an empire, knowing that defeat was almost certain? The story of Spartacus is not just a tale of the past, it is a mirror of the present. Just as he refused to live shackled, how many invisible chains still bind us? How many of us accept a life we did not choose, suffocated by fear, by routine, by the rules imposed by a system that does not want us free? But here, together, we can change that. We can reclaim the essence of resistance, courage, and transformation. This channel is not just a space for stories, it is a movement. And you are part of it. If this message resonates within you, if somehow this flame has awakened something inside, do not let it extinguish. Click like to strengthen this voice and subscribe now so that this message reaches more people. You are not just pressing a button, you are helping to spread a revolution of consciousness. Together, we are stronger. Together, we can inspire thousands to break their own chains. Let's take this story further, let's build a legion of free minds. Are you in this battle? Then leave your comment and join us. The fog of history shrouds the origin of one of the greatest symbols of resistance against tyranny in mystery. Spartacus was not born in chains. Before he was a slave, he was a warrior. Before he was a gladiator, he was free. His homeland, Thrace, now part of Bulgaria, was a region of indomitable warriors, men accustomed to battle, whose fierce spirit did not easily bend. Spartacus grew up among them, learning the way of arms, forging his courage on the battlefields. But fate, cruel and ironic, led him to fight not for his homeland, but for the empire he would one day challenge. Recruited by the Roman army, Spartacus became a soldier in the service of the Republic. The Roman legions were relentless, organized, and disciplined, and those who joined them were expected to show blind obedience. But for Spartacus, submission was never an option. At some point in his journey, something happened. Accounts differ on the exact reason, but the truth remains undeniable: he was taken prisoner. Some say he deserted. Others claim he rebelled against his commanders. There are even those who believe that Rome, suspicious of the loyalty of the Thracian warriors, decided to punish him. Whatever the reason, Spartacus was chained, sold, and condemned to a fate worse than death. Rome did not merely conquer territories, it turned them into spectacles. The men who once fought to protect their lands now served as entertainment for the Roman nobles, who reveled in the spectacle of spilled blood. Spartacus's fate led him to Capua, where he was bought by the Lannister Lentulus Batiatus. This man owned a ludus, a school for gladiators, where slaves and prisoners were transformed into beasts of combat. The training was brutal. Pain, suffering, and discipline were the only masters. The men who entered there lost their identity. They were given new names, imposing titles, but these concealed a cruel truth. They were merely commodities, disposable pieces in a cruel game of power and pleasure. In the arena, it did not matter who you were before entering. What mattered was only how you fought and how long you could survive. Those who failed died. Those who won, killed. But Spartacus did not accept this fate. He saw the faces of the other slaves, saw their eyes dimmed by hopelessness. He knew that if he remained there, he would end up like all the others, a forgotten corpse in the blood-stained sand. He was not just a strong man. He was intelligent. He observed, learned, understood the system. He knew that the only way out was to fight. Not in the arena, but against those who kept him captive. The year was 73 BC. Patience had run out. Despair had given way to fury. And Spartacus, along with about 70 other gladiators, decided it was time to act. They had no weapons. But they had something even more dangerous, the conviction that they had nothing to lose. In the dead of night, while the guards settled into their routine, a plan was set in motion. The chains were broken, the gates violated, and the walls that separated them from freedom were crossed with a ferocity that Rome had never imagined possible. The fight began within the ludus itself. The gladiators attacked with improvised knives, using everything they had at their disposal. With precise and relentless strikes, they eliminated the guards one by one. Blood flowed across the stone floor, but for the first time, it was not the prisoners' blood. Chaos took over the place. Fear changed sides. The Romans, accustomed to seeing those men as mere entertainment, now saw them as hungry predators. And then, the guards' weapons passed into the hands of the slaves. Swords, shields, spears, instruments that had once been used to keep them submissive would now be used to conquer their freedom. Free from the prison that held them, Spartacus and his companions had nowhere to go. The city of Capua was under Roman control, and any attempt to stay would mean death. The solution? To flee to the hills of Mount Vesuvius. There, in the wild shelter of the mountain, a group of fugitive gladiators became the embryo of something much larger. What began as an escape would soon become a revolt of unimaginable proportions. The news spread. Slaves throughout the region began to hear the rumors. The gladiators have escaped. A man named Spartacus leads the revolt. They have challenged Rome. Gradually, the deserters became an army. Men and women who had been forced to live on their knees now had a choice. And they chose to fight. But Spartacus was not just any leader. He did not want mere revenge. He wanted freedom. While Rome saw slaves as property, he saw a people who could be free. He saw something that the Roman senators and generals could never imagine, the beginning of a war that would make Rome tremble. This revolt was not just an uprising of gladiators. It was a real threat, something that could shake the foundations of the Republic. And Rome, accustomed to subjugating entire nations, would soon realize that it was facing an enemy that could not be ignored. The revolution had begun. And the empire was not prepared for what was to come. The sun scorched the stone courtyards where training never ceased. The sound of clashing swords, the shouts of instructors, and the impact of bodies against the ground formed the daily soundtrack of those who had been reduced to mere instruments of entertainment. The life of a gladiator was not a choice, it was a sentence. Before becoming a legend, before rising as a symbol of resistance, Spartacus tasted the bitter flavor of servitude. He witnessed firsthand the brutality of the ludus, where men were broken and rebuilt as killing machines. There, pain was the teacher, and death, the only certainty. The gladiators came from different backgrounds. They were condemned criminals, slaves captured in battles, or even free men who, in desperation, sold themselves to the ludus in search of glory and money. But once inside those walls, their identities were erased. They received new names, new roles, new rules, and the only way out was through victory or death. For Spartacus, arriving at the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus marked the beginning of a living hell. He was no longer a free warrior from Thrace. Now, he was just a slave. From the first day, he closely observed the fate that awaited those who failed. The weak were quickly discarded, their bodies were taken away without ceremony, and no one spoke of them. Those who survived the training became valuable pieces in the game of Roman spectacles. But none of them owned their own lives. The gladiators underwent exhausting training, designed not only to strengthen their bodies but to transform their minds. They needed to be fierce but controlled. Deadly but strategic. Each new recruit was evaluated, and their fate was charted according to their skills. The different styles of gladiators were not chosen at random, each played a specific role in the theater of the arena. Mirmillo, the heavy gladiator, armed with a large shield and a short sword, Gladius. Inspired by Roman legionaries, he was trained to withstand impacts and advance like a living wall. Retiarius, the most agile of the gladiators, armed only with a net and a trident. His survival depended on speed and precision. If he was slow, he would die before he could attack. Thrax, inspired by Thracian warriors, he wielded a curved sword, Sicca, and a small shield. His technique was based on quick movements and slicing attacks. Hoplomachus fought with a spear and a small shield, evoking ancient Greek warriors. His specialty was ranged combat, trying to keep the enemy at bay. Secutor, created to be the rival of the Retiarius, this gladiator wore a smooth helmet, a short sword, and a large shield. His goal was to chase down and eliminate the more agile opponents. Spartacus was shaped to be a Thrax, carrying with him the combat style of his homeland. But his mind was never tamed. While training alongside other slaves, he saw the fear in their eyes, fear of failure, fear of death, fear of never being free again. The trainers not only strengthened the bodies of the gladiators, they also worked on their minds. The ludus was not just a physical prison, it was a psychological one. Those who accepted their role as mere instruments of the spectacle had a greater chance of survival. Rome offered a seductive promise to the gladiators: glory. The most skilled could gain fame, money, and even, in rare cases, freedom. They were trained to believe that the arena was an opportunity, a stage where they could earn the respect and even the love of the crowd. But this glory was a cruel illusion, for in the end, a gladiator was never truly free. Even the most victorious were the property of their masters. Even those who earned the people's acclaim still had to fight, still had to kill to survive. And when they were no longer useful, they were discarded. After months of training, the gladiators were finally taken to the arena. The great Colosseum of Rome did not yet exist in the time of Spartacus, but the amphitheaters scattered throughout the empire were already centers of bloody entertainment. The games were planned as a theatrical spectacle. It was not just about fighting, it was about narrative, emotion, and cruelty. The gladiators were the protagonists of a drama that always ended in blood. The combats could be individual or in groups. Sometimes, a gladiator was thrown against wild beasts, lions, tigers, and even bears. The crowd cheered, applauded, and shouted. The more brutal the fight, the greater the pleasure of the audience. It was the patricians, the nobles of Rome, who determined the fate of the defeated gladiators. If a warrior fell, his life was in the hands of the public and the editor of the spectacle. A simple thumb movement decided between mercy and death. But for Spartacus, the arena was not a stage of glory. It was a cage disguised as a spectacle. While other gladiators accepted their fate, he saw something more. He saw the arena as a battlefield. Each fight was a test. Each defeated enemy was a step in his climb to something greater. He did not want to impress the audience. He wanted to survive to one day break the chains. The brutality of the ludus was not enough to break him. The chains of slavery were not strong enough to hold him. Spartacus watched, learned, waited. He saw the other gladiators being consumed by the system. He saw those who resigned and those who died trying to fight. But he was not just any gladiator. He was a warrior who refused to accept the fate imposed by Rome. And it was there, inside the ludus, amidst brutal training and deadly battles, that the desire for rebellion was born. The gladiators were trained to fight each other, but what if, instead, they fought together? What if the same men who were forced to kill each other in the arena united for something greater? Spartacus began to see a possibility that Rome had never imagined. The gladiators were living weapons. And perhaps it was time to turn them against their masters. The training, the pain, the spilled blood, all of it served a purpose. A purpose that Rome could not foresee. The revolution was just beginning. The roar of the crowd was deafening. The sound of thousands of Romans vibrated through the rough stones of the amphitheater as the gates slowly opened, creaking like the teeth of a hungry beast. Inside, under the scorching sun or the flickering light of torches, the sandy floor became an altar of death. Blood soaked the ground, mingling with the dust and sweat of the men fighting not for glory, but for survival. In ancient Rome, violence was the most desired spectacle. The people did not just watch the fights, they, thirsty for blood, clamored for it. It did not matter whether it was battles between gladiators, executions of prisoners, or hunts against wild beasts. Each scream, each wound, each last breath elicited a frantic response from the audience. The Colosseum and the arenas were not merely places of entertainment. They were tools of control. Rome grew with each conquest, absorbing peoples and cultures, but with that came tensions. Social inequality was brutal. While the patricians lived surrounded by luxury and privilege, the plebeians and slaves struggled to survive. The empire knew that an unhappy population could rebel. So, a solution emerged: bread and circuses. The concept was simple and terrible. The government offered free food and bloody entertainment to keep the people distracted. While citizens were busy watching the massacre in the arena, they had no time to question the injustices. The games were not just a pastime. They were a strategy. Rome fed its thirst for blood while stifling any possibility of revolt. And Spartacus understood this. He saw how the rulers used the arenas to turn violence into spectacle and brutality into a means of domination. But he would not accept being a pawn in this game. The greatest symbol of this system was the Colosseum, one of the most grandiose architectural feats of ancient Rome. Built under the Flavian dynasty, this gigantic stone structure could hold up to 50,000 spectators. The design was a masterpiece of Roman engineering. It featured advanced drainage systems, underground tunnels for gladiators and beasts, and impeccable organization to ensure that the spectacle flowed without interruptions. Each seat in the Colosseum reflected the social hierarchy. The senators and elite sat in prominent places, close to the arena, where they could observe every blow and every death up close. Common citizens sat further away, but still had a clear view of the horror. At the top, almost forgotten, were the women and the poor, huddled together as if they were less important than the very ground they stood on. There, amidst the screams and the clashing of blades, gladiators faced off to please the powerful. They were treated as disposable pieces, their lives worth only as much as they could entertain. But Spartacus no longer wanted to fight to amuse Rome. He wanted to destroy it. The games were not mere battles. They were scripted like theatrical plays. Everything in the arena was carefully planned to evoke emotion and ensure that the audience left satisfied. The duels between gladiators followed a symbolic structure. Fighters with different combat styles were pitted against each other to heighten the unpredictability and excitement of the clash. The audience wanted to see blood, yes, but they also craved tension, suffering, moments of glory and despair. In addition to traditional fights, there were other brutal spectacles, such as the V-Nations, hunts where gladiators or criminals were forced to fight against lions, tigers, and even rhinoceroses. Public executions, where prisoners were killed in the most cruel ways imaginable, burned alive, crucified, or torn apart by wild animals. Naval battles, where the Colosseum was flooded to simulate epic fights with real boats. For a gladiator, death was always imminent. But the worst of all was the final decision. If a warrior fell, his life was in the hands of the audience and the emperor. A thumbs up could mean mercy. A thumbs down, a death sentence. Winners could gain gold, fame, and even, in rare cases, their freedom. But for the defeated, the fate was oblivion. Their bodies were dragged out of the arena and dumped like trash, without burial, without honors, without memory. For Spartacus, each fight in the arena was a lesson. He observed how the crowd reacted. He perceived the hypocrisy of the Romans, who applauded death while considering themselves civilized. He saw men being reduced to beasts by a system that profited from their suffering. He felt the weight of the invisible chains that bound not only the gladiators but all the people of Rome. And then, something changed within him. Spartacus no longer wanted to fight just to survive. He wanted to fight for something greater. He wanted those arenas, which served to humiliate and destroy the gladiators, to become the stage for his revolt. The ludus was not just a training ground. It was an army waiting to be awakened. The arena was not just a place of massacre. It could be the beginning of the end for Rome. And Spartacus would no longer fight to entertain the elite. He would fight to overthrow it. The steel glimmered in the sunlight, stained with blood and dust. The cries of Roman soldiers faded in the air before their blades found a target. The insurgents, men who had once been slaves and gladiators, fought with a fury that Rome could not comprehend. To the senators and patricians, they were merely unruly servants that needed to be crushed. But Spartacus knew the truth. They were not just slaves fleeing. They were a reborn army. The revolt was not merely a desperate escape. It was a declared war against the greatest empire in the world. The escape from the ludus of Capua was just the beginning. Spartacus and his men were not simple fugitives trying to survive. They had a purpose. They wanted revenge. The small group of gladiators that escaped the ludus soon grew stronger. They spread out across the neighboring cities, attacking the properties of patricians and Roman villages. But the true impact of the revolt came when the slaves heard about Spartacus. Rumors traveled fast along the roads of Rome. A man has risen against the masters. For those who spent their lives in chains, the news was a promise. Slavery was not an inevitable fate. It could be fought. And so, from a handful of gladiators, the revolt grew into an army. Thousands of slaves fled from farms, mines, and their masters' homes to join the cause. Some were Roman peasants who had been forced into servitude by debts. Others were foreign soldiers that Rome had captured in its conquest campaigns. Each new recruit brought with them a burning desire for freedom and an insatiable rage against their oppressors. With every village plundered, with every patrician mansion set ablaze, Spartacus sent a message to Rome: "You have chained us. Now we will burn everything." At first, the Senate did not take the revolt seriously. How could a band of slaves pose a real threat to the most powerful empire in the world? Rome sent small legions to quickly quash the rebellion. Their mistake was thinking they were dealing with desperate peasants. Spartacus was not just a gladiator. He was a warrior. As a former Thracian soldier, he was well versed in military tactics. But more than that, he knew the enemy. He understood how the Romans fought, knew their weaknesses, and how to exploit them. The result was a massacre. When the first Roman legions clashed with the rebels, they were decimated. The soldiers were caught off guard by an army that did not fight as they expected. The former slaves employed guerrilla tactics. They attacked at night, ambushed patrols, used the terrain to their advantage. When Rome expected a traditional battle, the rebels hid. When they anticipated silence, the war cries came from all directions. News of the defeats began to spread. Spartacus had done the unthinkable. He had defeated Rome. The rebellion grew rapidly. Spartacus's army was no longer a disorganized group. Now they numbered in the tens of thousands. It is estimated that at the height of the revolt, over 100,000 men, women, and children marched under Spartacus's leadership. Rome was in a panic. The Senate, which had previously ignored the revolt, now saw the real danger. If Spartacus was not stopped, Rome could fall. The empire had faced powerful enemies before: kings, generals, entire nations. But it had never faced a threat like this, an army formed by those who had been considered disposable. The Roman senators began to fear a catastrophic scenario. What if more slaves rebelled? What if Spartacus's revolt spread across the provinces? Rome could not allow the rebellion to continue. They needed a general cruel enough to exterminate Spartacus and all his followers. And so the Senate called upon Marcus Licinius Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus was a man of insatiable ambition. The richest man in Rome, a relentless senator, and a ruthless strategist. He saw Spartacus's revolt as a threat, yes, but also as an opportunity. If he were the one to crush the rebellion, his name would be forever etched in the history of Rome. He would gain prestige, influence, and perhaps even absolute power. Crassus would not make the same mistakes as the previous generals. He knew that Spartacus was not a common enemy. And for that reason, he would use even more brutal methods. The first thing he did was gather a colossal army. Crassus recruited about 50,000 Roman soldiers, not only experienced legionaries, but also auxiliary troops and mercenaries. The second thing he did was instill terror among his own troops. He brought back one of the most feared punishments of ancient Rome, decimation. To show that he would not tolerate cowardice among his soldiers, Crassus ordered that 1 in every 10 soldiers from his legions be beaten to death by their own comrades. The message was clear: anyone who failed to destroy Spartacus would suffer a fate worse than that of the rebellious slaves. Rome would no longer fight with arrogance. Now, it would fight with hatred. Spartacus knew that the war was reaching its climax. He had defeated the Romans many times, but this time the enemy was different. Crassus was not just another incompetent general sent by the Senate. He was methodical, calculating, merciless. He did not just want to win, he wanted to exterminate the revolt. He wanted to destroy every trace of it, ensure that no slave would ever dare challenge Rome again. And Spartacus knew that if he lost this battle, there would be no mercy. The fate of Rome's greatest enemy was sealed. But Spartacus would not back down. Because he was not fighting just for himself. He was fighting for all those who had been enslaved, humiliated, and forgotten. And if this were to be his last battle, he would make Rome remember his name forever. The torches flickered inside the Senate. The heat of the discussion seemed to ignite the cold marble of the Roman columns. The rebellion of Spartacus was not merely a war of slaves against masters. It was a tremor in the very structure of the empire itself. While thousands of men fought on the roads and hills of Italy, another battle was taking place within Rome. Not with swords, but with words, gold, and daggers hidden beneath the senators' silk robes. Rome was not just an empire of glory and conquest. It was a nest of vipers. Marcus Licinius Crassus did not offer to defeat Spartacus merely for the good of Rome. He wanted much more than that. Crassus was already the richest man in the city, owner of numerous properties, and responsible for one of the largest networks of influence in the empire. But that was not enough. He wanted to be remembered as the savior of Rome. And, above all, he wanted supreme power. His goal was simple: crush the revolt and use the victory to consolidate his position in government. Crassus knew that if he destroyed Spartacus, his influence in the Senate would increase. He could demand new titles, positions, and perhaps pave the way for something greater: absolute command over Rome. But he was not alone in this ambition. As Crassus marched to war, another man watched everything with interest: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or simply Pompey. Pompey was one of Rome's most celebrated generals, a hero of campaigns abroad. But he was far from Italy when the revolt began. And that irritated him deeply. He knew that if Crassus defeated Spartacus alone, he would be overshadowed. The victory would grant Crassus too much power. And Pompey could not allow that. So, when the rebellion was nearing its end, Pompey intervened in a calculated manner. He brought his legions back from Hispania and marched to southern Italy. By the time he finally arrived, the final battle against Spartacus was practically decided. But that did not matter. What mattered was who would claim the glory. While the generals fought for prestige, the Roman Senate fought against its own fear. The revolt of Spartacus had revealed something the senators feared to admit: Rome was a fragile empire. The city depended on slaves for everything. From harvests to construction, from mines to domestic services, the entire empire was sustained by the forced labor of millions of men and women. If Spartacus had managed to escape, if more slaves had rebelled, if another revolt arose, Rome could crumble. That is why the Senate demanded not just a victory. It demanded an example. It was not enough to defeat Spartacus. It was necessary to destroy any hope of freedom. The senators pressured Crassus to ensure that the punishment was so brutal that no one would ever dare to rebel again. And so, Rome prepared for a spectacle of terror. But while they debated the best way to end the revolt, the senators played their own dirty games. Corruption was common among the powerful in Rome. Bribes, conspiracies, and betrayals happened daily. Many patricians did not want the war to end so quickly. Some profited from the sale of weapons and supplies. Others wanted to see Crassus and Pompey politically destroy each other, paving the way for their own ambitions. There were even rumors that certain senators secretly financed the revolt, hoping to use it as an excuse to topple political rivals. Who really governed Rome? The emperor? The Senate? Or a select group of men who moved the pieces of the game while pretending to debate the fate of the Republic? The fate of Spartacus was sealed. But in the end, he was not just fighting against Rome. He was fighting against a system that fed on lies, betrayals, and greed. And that system would not fall with a sword. The dust of the road rose to meet the gray sky. The smell of blood and iron permeated the air. The revolt that made Rome tremble was about to end. The army of Spartacus, once victorious against Roman legions, now faced its fate. They were thousands, but they were exhausted, surrounded, out of supplies, without hope. Marcus Licinius Crassus, with his well-armed and disciplined legions, blocked any escape route. To the north, Pompey waited to crush anyone who escaped. The trap was complete. And Spartacus knew it. He would not flee. He would not kneel. If this was to be his last battle, he would fight until his last breath. The ranks of men who were once slaves organized for the final fight. Many were afraid, but all were ready. Spartacus walked among them, his sword worn by time, his body covered in scars. He looked into the eyes of each warrior, as if to say, "You are already free. The rest does not matter." Gradually, silence turned into war cries. They would not die as prisoners. They would not die as slaves. They would die as warriors. Then, the sound of Roman trumpets echoed. Crassus gave the order. The legionaries advanced. The impact was brutal. Shields clashed, swords tore flesh, spears pierced bodies. The Roman soldiers had impeccable training, discipline, and armor. Spartacus's men had fury, desperation, and a burning desire for revenge. The Romans advanced like an impenetrable wall, but Spartacus fought like a caged animal. Each of his strikes cut a soldier in half, each movement was a deadly dance. Around him, his men fell one by one. The ground became a sea of bodies, a field of bones. But he kept fighting. Spartacus knew that this battle could not be won. But if he could kill Crassus, perhaps the fate of the war would change. With a fierce shout, he rallied the warriors who were still standing and charged towards the Roman general. The legionaries tried to stop him, but he cut down anyone who stood in his way. His blade found flesh, bones, and armor. He was unstoppable. He got so close to Crassus that the general could see death in his eyes. But fate was not on Spartacus's side. Before he could reach his target, he was struck. A spear pierced his shoulder. Then another. And another. His body fell. But he did not collapse. He refused to fall. With blood streaming down, he continued to fight, even without strength. Even when everything was lost. But Rome was an insatiable monster. And on that day, the monster won. The massacre was absolute. Those who did not die fighting were captured. Crassus did not just want to win. He wanted to turn Spartacus's defeat into an eternal lesson. 6,000 survivors were crucified along the Appian Way. For miles and miles, bodies writhed on the wood, groaning in agony as the sun burned their skin and the crows tore at their flesh. But something intrigued the Romans. The body of Spartacus was never found. No soldier could confirm his death. No prisoner revealed where he was. The man had disappeared, but his legend was just beginning. Well, we are moving on to the next topic, but first I noticed that you didn't leave your like on this video. This is very important for YouTube to continue promoting our content to you, and thus we will keep helping you, so go ahead and give this video a like, it's free, thanks. The dust settled. The battlefield was taken by the silence of death. But while Rome celebrated its victory, unknowingly, it had created something greater than any army of slaves, the myth of Spartacus. His body was never found. His name was whispered from generation to generation. The man became a legend, an eternal symbol of the struggle against oppression. Rome crushed the revolt, crucified thousands, tried to erase any trace of his existence. But it failed. Unlike generals and emperors who had their names written in marble, the story of Spartacus survived in the hearts of the oppressed. He was not remembered because he was a king or a politician, but because he represented something that can never be destroyed, the desire for freedom. Throughout the centuries, Spartacus became a symbol. In the Middle Ages, stories about his revolt inspired peasants to challenge feudal lords. In the 18th century, French and American revolutionaries saw in him the spirit of resistance against the powerful. In the 19th century, Karl Marx and other socialist theorists considered him a hero of the class struggle. In the 20th century, the fight for civil rights and against totalitarian regimes evoked his courage. Each generation that rose against injustice found in Spartacus an example that no empire is eternal, no chain is unbreakable. If Rome tried to erase his existence, art ensured that this would never happen. Movies, books, series, and even plays brought Spartacus back to life. The most iconic work was the film Spartacus, 1960, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Kirk Douglas. With the famous scene where all the slaves rise and say, "I am Spartacus," the story gained even greater strength in the popular imagination. Then came the series Spartacus, 2010 to 2013, which provided a brutal and visceral approach to his journey. For the first time, the modern audience saw the cruelty of the ludus, the savagery of the battles, and the depth of the revolt. Pop culture embraced Spartacus because his story is not just about a man, it is about an ideal. But one question persists: could Spartacus have defeated the greatest empire in the world? If he had marched directly on Rome, could he have taken it? Or would it have been just a fleeting victory before the Senate's brutal revenge? His numbers were immense, but his soldiers were slaves and peasants, while Rome had the best-trained legions in history. And what if he had escaped? If he had taken his men out of Italy, to a land where they could live free? History gives us answers, but it also leaves us to imagine, what if? Time has swept away empires, kings, and armies. Rome fell. Its temples were plundered, its legions faded into the dust of history. But the name of Spartacus endured. He survived not because he erected statues or minted coins with his face, but because he embodied something immortal, the struggle for freedom. The question that echoes through the centuries is inevitable: what if Spartacus had won? The revolt of Spartacus was the greatest internal threat that Rome faced before the rise of Christianity. No army of slaves ever got so far. But if he had marched on Rome and taken the city, would that have been the end of the empire? Rome was gigantic, a virtually indestructible war machine. Even if Spartacus had conquered the capital, the legions scattered across the world would return to regain control. But what if, instead of a great military victory, he had sparked a wave of rebellions? History shows us that revolutions begin with small sparks. If other slaves and subjugated provinces had risen at the same time, Rome could have collapsed decades earlier. But would slavery have ended? Rome depended on slavery. Millions of men, women, and children were forced to work on plantations, in mines, and in construction. If Spartacus's revolt had spread, the economic structure of the empire would have been shaken. But were Spartacus's own followers ready to end slavery, or did they just want to reverse the roles? History is full of revolutions that began with the promise of freedom and ended with new tyrants. If Spartacus had won, would he have been a liberator or a new warlord? Perhaps Rome would have simply been replaced by another oppressive system. Or maybe his victory would have accelerated the collapse of the empire, completely changing the course of Western history. At the time, Rome won the battle. But over time, the ideas that Spartacus represented triumphed. Slavery, which seemed eternal, was abolished centuries later. The absolute power of the emperors crumbled. And his story continued to be told, inspiring uprisings, revolutions, and struggles for justice throughout the centuries. Perhaps Spartacus did not conquer Rome with his sword, but he conquered something even greater: eternity. Now, one last question remains for you. If you were in Spartacus's place, would you have fought or accepted your fate? Thank you for watching until now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep receiving the next content. Until the next video.